Apologies, folks. We were having a nice chat there without you, but we're back. We are live now. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is great to be with you. I'm Simon from Data Reportal. I am clearly not a tech genius, but I'm doing my best to try and bring you the first of what I hope will be an ongoing series of Ask Us Anything for NGOs sessions today. So this is hopefully going to be a series of sessions where we will bring you all the latest insights, tips, and advice for folks working in the non-profit sector. I am very pleased to have a bunch of genuine experts with us today. So the three people that you can see on your screen with me today are your panelists for today. They're going to be sharing their amazing experience and wisdom with you over the next maybe hour or so. We'll see how we go, depending on whether they can stay awake or can survive without coffee that long. Let's do a quick round of introductions before we dive into the content. So Val, I know you've just done this once, but I'm going to ask you to do it live now that we're actually activating the stream. Val, over to you.
Practice makes it better, so I'm glad I got that chance. Thank you so much, Simon, for having us talk about social media and digital for NGOs. I'm Val. I'm the Global Head of Digital Engagement, and I started my career from all the way from social media intern at Newsweek to Global Social Media Manager at Amnesty, and now leading the digital team there. So I'm quite excited to talk to everyone about all things digital for nonprofits.
Great stuff. Thanks very much for joining us, Val. Really appreciate it. Maria, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Thanks, Simon. And thanks for organizing this. My name is Maria. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I studied international relations at NYU, and I studied creative digital marketing at Brother Escuela de Creativos, which in English would be Brother School of Creatives. I'm currently the Digital Communications Associate at Women Deliver, where I manage our 7 social media accounts. Women Deliver, for those of you who don't know, is a global advocacy organization that champions gender equality and the health and rights of girls and women in all their intersecting identities. And digital communications is a key tool for how we do our advocacy.
Great stuff. You said 7 platforms, did you?
7 accounts, 4 platforms.
Right. Okay, great stuff. In which case, I've got questions coming up for you very shortly once we start our Q&A. Dante, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, Simon. Thank you, colleagues. It's great to be with you too. Dante, I am currently the social media strategist at IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We use also a number of social media platforms to connect with our communities of volunteers and staff, Red Cross, Red Crescent supporters. I am originally from Mexico, and I'm still very passionate about social media, all things digital. And voila, that's why we are here today to have a great conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Great to have you with us. So I am Simon Kemp. I am the Chief Analyst at Data Reportal, and I produce the Global Digital Reports series on behalf of We Are Social and Hootsuite. If you've come across those, we spend our lives sharing data with you, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of insight into that in just a moment. Just before we get started with that, though, I would like to just point out a couple of things. First of all, thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you want to drop a little note to us in the comments, let us know who you are and where in the world you're joining us from. That would be wonderful. Just put those in the comments so we can see who you are, and then you will be able to ask your questions throughout today's session as well. I'll tell you about that more in just a moment. I also just wanted to let you know that all of today's speakers will only be sharing their personal opinions during this session, so none of us are speaking on behalf of or representing any organization. Okay, so as I mentioned, today is supposed to be an Ask Us Anything session where you, the audience, are able to ask us all of your questions, especially to our esteemed panel. So I've been on a few sessions with these guys before, and I learned so much from hearing about their experience, especially from an NGO perspective, but also just more broadly in the world of social media as well. So please do start thinking of the questions that you would like to ask them now. But just before we get into the Q&A, I thought it might be helpful to share some of the latest data and headlines from our global digital reports to give you some context for today's session, but also hopefully give you some handy sound bites for your 2022 plans. So let me just bring up my presentation. Okay, let's start with some of the big numbers. Almost 4.9 billion people around the world now use the internet, and that's equal to more than 60% of the world's total population. Research from GWI shows that the average internet user now spends almost 7 hours per day online too, which is equivalent to more than 40% of their waking life. And interestingly, people across regions like Southeast Asia and Latin America say that they spend more time online than people in Europe and Northern America say that they spend online. So, while adoption rates still tend to be lower across lower and middle income economies than they are elsewhere, it does seem that once people in these regions gain access to the internet, they tend to rely more heavily on it. Roughly 3 billion people remain offline though, with women in poorer countries disproportionately less likely to use the internet than other demographics. There's still plenty of work to do here too, especially because improved internet access can help to accelerate improvements in other areas such as education and financial empowerment. However, the encouraging news is that research from GSMA Intelligence shows that the connectivity gender gap is closing. So, with more and more people spending ever more time online, it's perhaps not surprising to learn that we're doing an ever broader range of things online too. And as you can see here, finding information remains the world's top motivation for using connected technology. However, the internet is now central to how we stay in touch with the people that we care about, and it also accounts for an increasingly large share of our entertainment activities too. Meanwhile, more than half of the world's working-age internet users say that they rely on online channels for news, while more than 4 in 10 of us say that we use online resources for education and for study. Overall, social media accounts for the largest share of the world's online activities, with data from @Annie showing that social media now accounts for half of all the time that we spend using our mobile devices. And because of this, social media represents a hugely valuable opportunity for NGOs. So let's take a closer look at the current state of social. And our latest analysis shows that there are now more than 4.5 billion social media users around the world, which is equivalent to more than 57% of the world's total population. And that figure is still growing too, at a rate of 10% per year, which means that well over 1 million new users join social media every single day. And for context, that means that roughly 2,000 new users will have started their social media journey since I started this very presentation. We're spending plenty of time on social media too, with the latest data revealing that a typical user now spends roughly 2.5 hours on social media every day. That equates to roughly 15% of our waking lives, but if we focus on younger age groups, that figure rises again to an average of almost 3 hours per day. Just to reassure you though, people are doing a lot more on social media than simply posting photos of their lunch. GWI's latest data shows that people all over the world are increasingly relying on social media to access news content, to find entertainment, and even to do their shopping. And perhaps as a result, we're spreading our social media activities across an ever wider range of platforms. The latest data reveal that, on average, working-age social media users around the world make active use of an average of 6.7 platforms every month. So it's perhaps not surprising to learn that at least 7 different platforms now reach an audience of at least 1 billion active users every month, with Facebook alone now reaching close to 3 billion users every month. However, it's worth stressing that people have quite different relationships with each of these different platforms. At a global level, users aged 16 to 64 say that WhatsApp is their favourite social media platform, but that's closely followed by Facebook. And it's worth stressing that this is what users themselves are telling us, so this data provides quite an interesting contrast to some of the stories that you will have seen in the media recently about public sentiment relating to Facebook. Perhaps most importantly though, with people using so many different social media platforms, there's a significant overlap in the audiences of each platform. And to put that in context, the latest data show that outside of China, we can now reach at least 99% of the users of any given social media platform on at least one other social platform. So the key takeaway here is that you don't need to be active on all social media platforms all the time. And in fact, once you've added 2 or 3 platforms to your mix, adding any additional channels will likely only result in you reaching the same audience over and over again. So perhaps a more strategic approach to social media channels, and to our online channels more broadly, may help you to make better use of your time and of your limited resources. And the good news is that that's exactly what today's session is all about, helping you identify activities that can help you achieve greater success in digital in 2022 and beyond. And as you've already seen, we've got an esteemed panel of experts with us today too, who can offer highly practical tips and ideas for anyone working in the NGO field. This live stream is intended to be an Ask Us Anything session too, so please take full advantage of our panelists' wisdom and experience by asking your questions now. If you're joining us on either LinkedIn or YouTube, you can ask your questions directly in the comments. And if you're joining us on Twitter, you can tweet us your questions using the hashtag AUA for NGOs, as shown on your screen here. You're welcome to ask questions throughout today's session, but please don't be shy. The sooner you ask your question, the more likely it is that we'll have a chance to answer it during today's live stream. And please remember that this session is dedicated to NGOs though, so please only ask questions relating to digital and social activities for non-profit organisations. Just before we open up the panel discussion, a quick reminder that you can access all of today's data, as well as the thousands more stats that we've published for every country in the world, all for free over on datareportal.com. And if you want to learn more about our reports, here are some of the ways that you can contact me. But with that, let's kick off our panel discussion. Right, data overload to kick you off on the session this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you're joining from. I can see from the comments that we've got people joining from Washington, from Singapore, from London. So a properly international crowd today. Thank you, everybody that's joining us. Please do remember, you can ask your questions to our panel whenever you like through today's session. Just pop those in the comments on LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll try and get to those as we go. Just to give you a moment to get your questions in, I know it's going to take a moment for you all to warm up, so I'm going to dive in with my question for our panel first of all. Was there any big surprises for you in that set of data? Was there any key takeaways that you think you really want to highlight to our audience today? And Val, I'm going to pick on you again first.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Thank you so much, Simon. Super interesting. And just to say to everyone that I think your report is this report is one of the most important tools in the day-to-day work that we do as NGOs. So it's super helpful to see a summary now of the latest findings as well, and it keeps changing. So it's really important, I think, to take a look at it whenever you can and adapt and test and change your strategy. So for me, I actually think that one of the most interesting things to think about is the point that you made on the overlap in audiences between different channels, because I know that, previously we've all been sort of, the strategies that we've had were, to tailor specific platforms with specific strategies to specific audiences. But I think what's really interesting to note, and what is interesting to sort of implement in some of our broader digital strategies, this really shows the need for like a cohesive voice across platforms, because people will see it no matter where. So you can't have, the email marketing communication doing one thing, and then the Facebook communication doing another thing and speaking completely differently with a different strategy and different approach and different everything. And then Instagram having a completely separate, way of operating. And so I think it's such a good point to make everyone think about the fact that, as human beings, we don't isolate some of these channels. It's something that we use on a daily basis, and sometimes you open your email, then you're on your WhatsApp, then you're open TikTok for a few minutes. And so it's important for us as NGOs to really remember that, and to really think about our values and how we translate those across different channels and to essentially the audiences that we need and that we want to communicate with.
Super important point. And it raises one of the issues I'd like to come back to a little bit later, once we've heard from our other two panelists. But this balance between being coherent and giving a consistent message versus one of the other sort of opposite ends of the spectrum I see, which is people repeating exactly the same thing in every channel again and again, which obviously is a bit like telling the same joke over and over again. It might be funny the first time, but it loses its magic. Let's come back to that in a little bit, though. Maria, I'd love to hear your key takeaways from the video as well.
Thank you, Simon. I agree with Val on so many of her points. But one thing that I keep having to remind myself is that Facebook is still so popular around the world, because I'm based in New York, right? And in the US, at least, Facebook is not as popular as it used to be, or maybe not like with certain generations, or maybe it's a platform that you use to communicate with your family, but not necessarily with NGOs and institutions, right? So the fact that Facebook is still so popular, even though, the pay to play and the algorithm are a little challenging for NGOs and institutions, it's a reminder that I have to have always. Like, Facebook is still popular, like we still have to pay attention to it. It's great news for Facebook fundraising though. Like, I have to say that's great news for that. But yeah, just a reminder that Facebook on a global level is still so popular. And obviously that varies across regions, across generations, but good reminder.
Yeah, I confess the data in there fascinates me when we start looking at those favorite as defined by the users themselves platforms. We do have data in the full report that shows you that broken down by age group and by gender. And it's amazing. I think if you read a lot of what's being published in the media at the moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking that nobody uses Facebook anymore and that it's about to die. The data tells a completely different story to that. So I agree with you. I have to remind myself a lot of the time that just because there's this thing that is being talked about everywhere in the media, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's our core focus. I can see we've already got questions coming in through the comments here, but Dante, just before we go to those, I'd love to hear your key takeaways from the data dump as well.
As Valeriia already mentioned, it's super important to have this global overview every 3 months, and we can actually see the new data points that come around. I like to focus right now on two of the numbers that you mentioned. First, the 6.7, which is basically the platforms that the average internet user are active on social media every month. So basically, I asked just my wife the other night how many platforms she actually used, and curiously, she actually mentioned 7. So it's relatable. It's a show. It also shows that our digital lives happen in many different places, even though we may have favorites. Even though most of the time, most of my time I spend it, for example, on Twitter, and in the other 7 data point that you mentioned about the 7 platforms that have over 1 billion users, which I also find fascinating, Twitter is not even near the top of the list. And I think every time that we share that data point with my colleagues, with my different peers, they always get a shock about the extraordinary importance of Twitter for communications in general, despite the fact that the active users base is not so large. That said, precisely because of very important users, relevant voices, organizations like ours, decision makers and policy decision makers are exactly what makes Twitter still so relevant in 2021. So I think those are some of the key thoughts that I always bring to the table when we need to make decisions about prioritization of resources. So when it comes, I saw some of the questions from some colleagues already in the comments about how to prioritize such scarce resources, right? So it all comes to what do you want to achieve as an organization. And I think once you have that definition from the leadership team, from the communications team, from all the parts of the house that make together, then you can actually come with ideas to make the most out of that.
Definitely. So I think thank you, Dante. That's a fantastic segue into actually answering some of these questions. So you're right. We've got at least one question. In fact, we've got 2 questions so far on paid. But this question comes through from Moritz, first of all, which I think is a really interesting one based on what you were just saying there about Twitter versus some of the other platforms. I think this idea of identifying who your audiences are and where on social they're going to be is, it's not just an NGO problem. This is the same for everybody, but I'm guessing because of the unique situation that many NGOs are in, where you've got diverse audiences you need to engage. So your fellow activists, your fundraising audience, sometimes you're looking at politicians and other sort of political organizations, you're looking at journalists, you've got all these different people. Maria, I'm going to pick on you for this one because you mentioned in your introduction to yourself that you were across these 6.7 across your 7 different accounts. I'm guessing part of the reason for that might be because you've got a variety of different audiences, or you want to share different things with different people. What's your take on this? So Maritz's question in particular is, how do we identify and target audiences on a global and or a local level? So this is a really good and really complex question to start with. I'd just love to get your headline thoughts on how you go about doing that in your role specifically.
Thanks, Simon. So we have 7 accounts because 2 of them are for like a younger generation. It's not necessarily global versus local.
Interesting. Okay.
But for this particular question, we did, and this is something that we try to do often, like Women Deliver works with the Deliver for Good campaign, which is a campaign for advocacy in Senegal and Kenya specifically, for example. So we have our global like Women Deliver Twitter account, and it's the same for LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. But when we're working with that campaign, we try to post, well, first of all, in French because of Senegal, but also in their timeline, like in their time zone. So they're more likely to see it. And we use their hashtag, and we have like the hashtag Deliver for Good Senegal, hashtag Deliver for Good Kenya, when it's like the national campaigns within the campaign. So that's one thing. Like whenever we try to do anything that is about different countries, like we had a campaign back in January where we published a report about the opinions of gender equality that citizens have around the world. And the report had both like the global perspective, but the survey run in 17 countries. So we also had the data sheets for each country specifically. So when we were sharing this on social media, we first of all translated things into those countries. So for example, like if we had the report from Canada, we had that one in English and French. So we could share it in both languages. And we tried to share it in their time zones, because we don't have accounts we don't have a global account and then the regional accounts like some other platforms have, like UNFPA, UN Women, like they all have these like regional accounts for this purpose. When you're a smaller team and you don't have those resources, you have the one account, but you try to adjust with languages, time zones, maybe the local hashtag for like something that is related to it. And that's kind of, how we go about it from the one platform.
So you mentioned that you've got like something for slightly different age groups. Are you doing that on different platforms? So I'm going to be cliched and stereotype here, but say you've got a TikTok account for younger audiences and a Twitter account for, is that the kind of approach you're looking at, or how are you doing it?
So TikTok is a dream. It's there. It hasn't happened yet. Women Deliver has the Youth Deliver Twitter and Facebook accounts because we have a Young Leaders program. So the Young Leaders program, like it goes way back, like it goes, a few years back. I think we're like the 4th class right now. So we have the Twitter account and the Facebook account. And then we used to have Facebook groups. We don't anymore. But the idea is that the young leaders and the alumni of the program connect on these platforms. So that's, and then like you have young people who are advocates in their countries, in their regions, in their local communities, who are maybe interested in the program or interested in learning from these young leaders and alumni. So they all connect on these 2 platforms within these 2 accounts. And there's like a lot of community building for young advocates in those platforms. And then the Instagram is Women Deliver, but half or more than half the audience is mostly the young advocates, young leaders, and alumni.
Excellent. Okay, so getting a very strong sense that community is a big part of that, which is going to drive me through to Val for the question here. So Val, in the work that you do, I'm guessing you've got even more of a challenge perhaps than some of the other people in your sector, in that you've got a variety of stakeholders that you need to engage on a favorable basis, and also some that you might want to be trying to persuade to change attitudes and behaviors. Do you deliberately segregate those conversations, or do you have them all in a very central place and try and get your community to participate in some of those opinion changing conversations?
This is my favorite question about audiences, because I actually think that the question of audiences and who to target is an organizational question and not necessarily just a digital question. So I think in the example of I'm just trying to pull up the question briefly that we had around global versus local. I think those kind of questions. So I think Moritz asked the question about global versus local. For me, I would always advise and recommend sitting down, together, if you're able to, not just with communication colleagues, not just with digital colleagues, not just with social colleagues, but together as an NGO sort of, and really thinking about which are the audiences that we really need to focus on for the next year to achieve what we want to achieve. So if you have global goals that you want to achieve, that's one thing. If there are specific local solutions, as you said, and that's a separate thing. And I think it's really important to get sort of a communal understanding of the audiences, because it's impossible to target the whole world to do everything. And it's really important to make sure that you have buy-in from the wider organization, from the wider NGO, as to the specific audience that is important for you at this point in time in your organizational development. In a year's time, it might be different. In a year's time, your audience might change. It might be something different. So this also relates to, Simon, the question that you asked. Do we spend our time and effort convincing the persuadable middle, or do we spend our time and effort convincing those who don't agree, completely cold audiences? And the question is that it really depends on what you are trying to achieve at a certain point in time in your organizational development. I can tell you what we're trying to do now. We're trying to really focus on the persuadable middle, on the people who might not know us but technically agree with our values, might not understand fully what we do. And so we really try to focus on the people globally, in countries where there is no Amnesty presence, to really try and develop a community of people who care about similar issues and similar topics, and want to connect together with each other for that. So for us, that's sort of our one main audience that matters, right? The people who value-wise can connect with us and who care about the things that we talk about, and then really defining and deciding what those channels are for communication, because we believe that at this point in time, it's important for us to really focus on the supporter base in order for Amnesty as a whole to achieve the goals that we've set out organizationally.
That's really interesting, and it leads me to a horrible question, which I'm going to ask to all of you. It's a tough question, so take a deep breath. Based on what you've just said there, do you think that it is possible for social media activities to change people's underlying opinions? Let me just give a bit of context to that to give you a chance to think of your answer. So I think one of the things that we've heard a lot about in the media recently is this idea that a lot of people are falling into echo chambers and rabbit holes on social media. We end up reinforcing and possibly amplifying some of the opinions and the sort of the perceptions that we have about the world, and we go down into this very extreme polarized place in social media. And as a result of that, it maybe gets to the stage where we're simply exaggerating and reinforcing things that we already think and believe, rather than doing what I would like to think social media allows us to do, which is see the opinions of everybody, even from outside our social circle, and then broaden our horizons. Am I being naive? Is it possible that social media allows us to do that, or is social media really as terrible as the media is making it out? Dante, I'm going to throw that to you first, and then we'll come back to the other two as well.
Well, that's the $1 million question, Simon. No? I think all of us that are working on the social for good sphere tend to be optimists, and at least try to do our very best to make a positive change. There are many examples of how that can have a positive influence. I remember, for example, one of the flagships videos that in my previous role when I was at WHO, we saw really having a massive impact was about mental health, and how a single really well-crafted public health communications material can essentially help people reach out for help. And we know that because of the thousands of comments. I remember one of those particular videos received more than 15,000 comments. So I don't know, like 7 years ago, which was already massive. It was one of the biggest success of WHO back then in those days. So we have seen great examples like that. We have seen also, on the other hand, terrible case studies that have been resonating quite a lot, rightfully, on the media and in the circles of social media professionals and even regulators. So I think that's also good news in terms of that this debate is happening. there are ways to try to influence it. That's why we have teams in I4C and others that are taking very seriously the community engagement and accountability approach, which is essentially evidence-based communications that are tailored for specific audiences, as also related to the previous question that our colleague had in terms of what are you generating, right? What is the purpose? Again, what Val was mentioning it comes back to what are you creating as an organization? Are you creating valuable materials for specific communities where those tools that you created actually needed by the community, where the community was actually involved in the creation of such materials that we believe might be useful for them? And if so, how can we exponentially help its dissemination so the impact can be amplified? So there are many questions that are happening right now at the moment, and I used to be more positive about it. Now I'm I would say I'm a bit more neutral, but I think otherwise it's just easier just to say, you know what, let's close the shop and do something else. But we are still hanging in here, so at least for now.
Fingers crossed. Maria, do you want to offer a couple of thoughts on this one?
Sure. I think this question takes me back to community and community engagement, to be honest. We sometimes because we post about gender equality, right? We post about sexual and reproductive health and rights. So these are topics that can lead to a lot of conversations on social media platforms, on our comments on Twitter or on our Instagram posts. And sometimes we see people have those conversations in our comments. Like, someone will post something against whatever it is we said, and then someone else will chime in and explain to them or like try to educate them, and then there's this whole conversation going. So you see the community doing their own advocacy within our comments and trying to like teach the other person why gender equality is important, or why this law to decriminalize abortion is important, or like things like that. So you see the community doing that work. And I think that the fact that our platforms, like our NGOs platforms, can be this space where these conversations happen, that's just a really important space to have for the change. I guess I'm still one of the most optimistic people in this space.
That's good.
At least for now, right? But it's good to have those spaces, and it's good that we are creating those spaces for people to have those conversations.
So you've mentioned community a couple of times, and I think that's a really good segue into another question that we've had here. So thanks for this question, Matt. I know that there's a few people who've been asking questions about paid versus organic, but I think the way that you're talking about community there, and the fact that the community is doing some of your job even, Maria, in some of those conversations and educating to people that perhaps don't have the full knowledge that we would like them to have. How are you guys balancing the budgets, if you even have any budgets at all? So I know each of you is in slightly different position, and you've got slightly different sizes of organization, you're in different fields and all that kind of stuff. So Val, let's start with you. Do you have a budget? And if so, how are you managing the difference between organic versus paid? And especially if you do have just a small budget, have you got any tips on how to maximize the power of that?
Yeah, for sure. Again, one of my favorite questions around paid versus organic. So I just wanted to start with, we do have a paid budget. Our paid budget is focused on acquiring new supporters. So our main metric is cost per opted-in supporter. So someone who we can communicate with in the long run, who wants to be contacted by us, essentially.
Right.
But I wanted to straight away bust a myth in that Facebook and other platforms want us to spend money on paid to be able to promote some of our work, because, as you know, a couple of years ago, Facebook has actually put in quite strict regulations around social issues in terms of paid. They're very strict about what you're allowed and not allowed to promote, including, with specific regulations in specific regions, in specific countries, places where they've gotten in trouble before for certain things. And this has had actually a negative effect on a lot of NGOs. We've been talking about this for quite a while. We've spoken to Facebook themselves, and we're really trying to find a way to make sure that we are not, I guess, penalized by the Facebook system just because we talk about things that may, going back to your question from before, counter some of those negative narratives and counter some of those negative sort of misinformation campaigns and whatnot. So it's been quite challenging. It's been quite hard to do paid. And so we've really tried to diversify what we do and how we do it on our digital channels, starting from, as Maria said, from community management to trying different platforms out to really, I know there's also a question about email and newsletters to, going back to our own platforms and thinking about the spaces that, as Dante calls them, the non-rented land, the land that we sort of own. And so it's really about being, reactive to the way that these platforms are also trying to manage what we do through their regulations and new updates. And in recent years, Facebook has done, not in recent years, in recent months, Facebook has done quite a lot to sort of, have an effect on our paid ability to do paid advertising. So that's kind of we are still trying. It's still possible in some places. It's quite hard to contact them, but I would say that paid budgets are necessary if you want, if you can, but if you can't, then there are other things that you can do. And that doesn't have to be just on Facebook to be able to create that organic community, basically.
Right. I think it's really interesting there. If you've got a situation where you, as an organization, perhaps have some issues that you are trying to promote that for whatever reason are coming up against barriers, to what extent is your community then going to be an essential part of your activity? So we've had a few mentions of community already. I know this is a topic that seems to be coming through thick and fast in the comments at the moment. So Dante, back to you in terms of the community bit here. Is it fair for me to even try and pick an example? I won't pick an example because I'll probably end up causing too much trouble by doing that. But if you want to cite an example from recent times in your work where you've had a very strong difference of opinion, perhaps in the community, and different active members of that community have then gone out and sort of tried to educate the other side, how important is that, and how would you try and prioritize that versus paid, for example?
Thanks for that, Simon. Well, first, just before I address your question, which is quite nice, I wanted to throw my hat, my 2 cents about the importance of paid and organic. And I think the key word, on top of what Val already mentioned for the challenges, there is one key word, and that is quality of content. When we have content of high quality that is extremely good, it can still have some traction on organic. And we know that because 95 or 99% of our social posts are organic, and we have a very limited budget when we have a budget. So we found that trying to focus on the quality of content really pays off, and that helps also for the paid boosting. And because people don't want to get terrible ads, so when you are boosting something, it will come as an ad. So if you can actually create a great ad, then you're making a great service for your organization and your social strategy. So basically, the best return on investment is on the quality of the content that we put out. And every time that we could put something that it's subpar, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And sometimes because of our internal constituencies, that very important people in the organization ask for some specific messaging in some specific form to be shared at some point, that can harm a lot of people in the NGO sector and government. And I can imagine that a lot of decisions that are not taken by communications people can actually harm the communications and digital colleagues. So I don't think that's exclusive from our sector. Indeed, that harms our efforts at the long run. Every time that we shoot ourselves in the foot, we don't have elsewhere to stand. It's hard to keep still standing when you do that. So you have to almost start from scratch. To address your question about difficult moments that we had with the communities, for example, through our COVID-19 response, our stellar designer has come up with amazing assets that resonate really well with some specific audiences. And when we see that some specific assets are getting extraordinary traction, we go and see what's going on, what triggered. And it happens to be that our IFRC audience has a lot of Red Cross volunteers from the Philippines. And at the specific timing where the Philippines was having a lot of misinformation around vaccines, they found our assets. And because of the trust that the public in the Philippines has on the Red Cross, that resonated particularly well with all that community. And we were able to see our post really going flying high over there. So that's one of the examples. Of course, as many as positive reactions we have, we also have a minority of very engaged views from opposing side of the spectrum, let's say. So that's one of the examples that I can recall that it's let's say quite engaging for sure.
Thank you. It's a really good segue to bringing up this question then from Claudia, perhaps. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. So this is one of those ones that I find fascinating because the second half of this question, controversy is harder to handle, especially on social, when your accounts represent an organization or institution than when you're an individual. Claudia, you're absolutely right. This is one of the challenges. I think I've got a question for you that goes back a little bit to the previous question on maximizing your reach and your impact. So the paid versus organic thing. I'm going to seize on your controversy bit here as an opportunity. One of the things that I've noticed when we look at the fringes of social media, when we look at some of the people that you might term as bad actors, the people who are giving social media a bad name, what I think they do really effectively is that they turn controversy into a megaphone. They deliberately provoke people with opposing views to come in and engage in the comments into a flame war. And as soon as they do that, it massively increases the engagement and therefore pushes it into the algorithm. I kind of feel like the temptation is there a lot of the time for us to engage in that kind of controversy because we know that it's going to really push the reach and we know that it's going to heighten the engagement. Maria, I'm going to put you on the spot and I can see you hiding behind the question almost in the feed there. So apologies for that. I'm going to bring you back to answer, maybe just give some thoughts on that because I'm guessing you are not a stranger to having at least some kind of controversy in the comments sections of the kinds of posts that you guys publish. What are your thoughts on this? How do you handle controversy and do you see it always as a negative?
So whatever we post, and because we do post about some things that can be considered controversial, there is an institutional process for reviewing those posts before they go out, first of all. So we work with our policy and advocacy team. The director of comms will look at it, like it gets approved by everyone who needs to approve it before it goes out. And the way we do advocacy is to call in, not call out. So we're not trying to call anyone out, make them look bad, antagonize them in any way. We're trying to call them in to do the work with us. So that's the way we frame these things even if we're flagging an issue, we're calling in partners, we're calling in policymakers, we're not calling them out. Because we want a partnership so we can make the progress and make good things happen, right? And antagonizing the other party is not going to achieve that. But we do get some hostile comments sometimes, that happens. And we ignore, choose to ignore, not engage. If another person chooses to engage, like I was saying earlier, if another one of our followers chooses to engage with the hostile comment, it's up to them, but we don't engage.
Gotcha. Val, I'm guessing controversy is a daily part of your life. How did you guys handle it? What's your perception of it?
I think totally agree with Maria that if we were to engage with everyone who disagreed with our opinions, that would require full-time, I don't know, not a full-time job, a full-time 6 people probably to be able to do that. But I wanted to say that I think what we also as NGOs need to think about when approaching these kind of topics is that we actually sometimes play into some of those narratives with our communication. And what I mean by that is, for example, when we say things like, do not imprison journalists, that sort of plays into some narratives that people may have, and all they will see is imprison journalists. So instead of talking about things that we're asking for them not to happen, we need to kind of paint the picture of what we actually want to achieve. And a good friend of mine and colleague, Thomas Coombs, does a lot of work on hope-based communication and the importance of, really putting forward our values, our visions, our understanding of the world, as opposed to responding to the people that may have opposing views to us. And I think a lot of NGOs fall into that trap a lot with our communication. And it's very hard to sort of remove yourself from that and really think about sort of a future looking, what is it that we really want people to think, and what do we want people to do? So, things that don't dehumanize people, and things that really show the consequences of action and activism, essentially. So painting the hopeful picture of where we want to move. And I think by sort of shifting our general communication strategy to focus on that as opposed to on a response, can really also help us avoid that controversy and convince people who may otherwise be triggered by certain words that we keep reusing over and over and over again.
Right. So just going back to Claudia's question here, this idea of should we avoid controversy, or is it something that we need to embrace? I kind of get the sense that you're all perhaps erring slightly more on the inclusive, not staying away from controversy, but perhaps not fueling it any further than it's already been stoked by people who are perhaps engaging with your content. Is that a fair interpretation of what you've said? Okay, and that's really, really interesting advice, because this is not unique to NGOs. You're going to see hate activity on pretty much anything on social media. So this is something that we're all going to have to deal with, and unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have to deal with it more and more in the future as well. So really great to be able to touch on that today. I can see that a couple of our panelists are reading through the questions. I'm trying to read them as well. Is there any of the questions you've seen in there already that you'd like to pick up on in particular? Panelists?
I like the one from Zainab, asking how to stay relevant in 2022 on social media while representing your organization. Honestly, by looking at the data. I think that's why your report is so valuable, Simon, and also the sources that come directly from the platforms. When we understand that digital changes at a very fast speed, we should also pay attention to the announcements and from the platforms themselves on what is working right now. For example, at the moment, there's no data about Twitter Spaces usage, but we know that Twitter is really interested in developing the tool, in making it widely available, in making real state within the app. When you have such radical changes, when there are, they say that in tech, if they actually put engineers behind it, then it's really a priority. It seems real for Twitter that Spaces, it's going to be a thing. And that's why, that's one of the things that we will be looking at very closely at IFRC. For example, during COP, we're hosting daily Twitter Spaces at 10 a.m. Central European time, all day during all COP. And we have had extraordinary exchanges. My colleague Melis and my colleague Marie have been our hosts during these 2 weeks. It has been a fascinating experience. You can see how social audio is really taking off. That helps a lot. And again, because they are this is work in progress, you can actually compound and create content further with the recordings. Now that Spaces has a recording option, you can actually record that audio and create a video or whatever, or have a quote from one of your senior spokespersons. This is something that can really help and go beyond the live exchange of a conversation. So I think that's one of the great approaches to see what is being pushed by the platforms, and again, understanding how to align that with what matters to your organization. For us, and I never get tired of asking, of actually sharing what we want on social media as IFRC. We want three things. We want presence, we want consistency, and we want shareability. So as long as these new engagements bring us presence, consistent with our values and our messaging, and it's shareable, which means it will bring more attention and makes it quality content, we are on the right track. We are on the right direction. So I think that can help other colleagues as well.
Nice, really good stuff. Maria, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but one last very quick question for Dante there. Just, you were talking about what Twitter itself is pushing, and I noticed over the last few days, Twitter has been pushing the tips, so donations to the account creators. Something that you're looking at as NGOs for possible donations to your cause? Is this something you would encourage, or do you have concerns about it?
I think it would be a great addition, particularly for the national Red Cross or Red Crescent societies within their markets. We, as a global Red Cross organization, find it more difficult in terms of fundraising globally because of the local constraints. But for the Singapore Red Cross, I think it would be fantastic. For the American Red Cross or the British Red Cross or Mexican Red Cross, I think they should go for it. And it's something that can really pay off in terms of the real value that the organizations are delivering on the ground. I think that's something that it's really valuable. And just, for example, my grandpa, unfortunately, fell in Cancun. He's 93 years old and had a fall a couple of weeks ago. My parents literally called the Red Cross in Mexico, and the local teams of the Red Cross went there, helped him recover. Those are ways of how the Red Cross is impacting directly the loved ones of mine. So those are the kind of examples that I think people would be really grateful if they could actually give back when facing such a direct connection.
Definitely. Really interested to see how it works. I think it's very clear that there's a real opportunity in there for NGOs, but you can see it spreading across all sorts of different parts of the creator community too. Right, Maria, I'm going to put you back on the spot here. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to come back to it because I know that this is a question that comes up again and again and again, especially for people who are struggling to spread resources. You know, they've got two people maybe in a team if they're lucky. They've only got one, and they've got to do everything. How do you choose which platforms to select and prioritize? What's your tips for anybody that is looking at 2022 and having questions from their organization saying, why are you not on TikTok? What are you doing with Snapchat? All these things. What do we do? How do we prioritize?
Well, funny that you ask, because that's kind of our case too. We do have a small team. And the first thing is for you to think about which platforms you can maintain with the resources that you have. For example, like TikTok, like I said, it's my dream, but we have a small team and we wouldn't be able to maintain it. Like, we wouldn't be able to create videos often enough and do the community engagement because of the resources that we don't have. So you have to think long term, do you have the ability to maintain these platforms active? And then you have to figure out what's the goal of your organization. It's similar to what Val was saying earlier, right? Like, you have to figure out what's your organization's priority right now, and maybe, you know, a year from now, and then go from there. Like, for us at least, like, because we do advocacy work, Twitter is the main platform that we use, because that's where you can reach decision makers, high-level officials, other partners in the sector, and so on. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, we keep up, but we post less often there. Like, we'll tweet at least once a day, but we'll post on those other three platforms maybe once a week. And there are things, like maybe you're doing an advocacy campaign and that can go across all platforms, but in slightly different ways, right? Like, you try to create content that it all applies to the same campaign, but it works better in each one. Like, maybe for Instagram, you choose a photo instead of a graphic, or you're sharing a new report and you have data about different things in that report. Like, if we publish a report about gender equality in general, for example, I know, because we've been doing the research for years, that the data about women in the workforce is going to do best on LinkedIn. So we post that data on LinkedIn to share the report. But then on Twitter, I know that anything about sexual and reproductive health and rights is going to do the one that performs best. So I choose that data to share on Twitter. And then on Instagram, I might choose to do quizzes and polls on Instagram stories instead of a post, because that way I engage my audience with the data and then like share the report with them so they can learn more. So you have to think about what works best in each platform with whatever product it is that you're trying to share. Because even though chances are like most of your audiences overlap, like, you know, on all platforms, like we were saying earlier, the way the platform works and what people are going to that platform for is going to affect how your content performs. And they still get to see maybe a new side of that exact same product, because maybe they saw the tweet about sexual and reproductive health and rights, but they also saw on LinkedIn the post about women in the workforce. So they're seeing like different aspects of the same product.
Nice. That's really beautiful circular back to what Val was saying at the very beginning about you want to have this consistency, but you're sort of also balancing that with consistency, but with a slightly different narrative based on the context, perhaps, of the different platforms. I can see we're running out of time. I could have this conversation with you guys all day, but I'm guessing you have lives to do, other things in like important work for the organizations you represent. Val, just one last thought from you before I give you my wrap-up question. So in terms of, suppose we were just elaborating on that question from there about choosing platforms. If somebody in the audience today is thinking about starting a new platform, perhaps they've not gone onto TikTok yet and they're looking at it for next year, do you have advice for somebody who is already stretched and debating whether or not they should jump onto the new platform or stick with what they've got?
Yeah, of course. I actually think it's totally okay to focus on one platform for a period of time. If you decide, you know, like Instagram is really important for us right now, it's totally okay to spend all your time and effort on Instagram whilst keeping up what you have. Otherwise, it's similar to TikTok. You know, if you really decide, you know, it's super important for us to be on TikTok right now because, you know, there are no voices that are talking about the topics that we are talking about. It's also okay to, you know, switch your focus and really start thinking about that. So it's really about figuring out what you really want to do as a digital communications specialist, but also as an organization. And I would say from just our experience, I think past couple of years, we've really focused on Instagram. In recent years, Instagram has really seen a shift from, you know, a place where people post photos of food and exercise and nights out to a platform for change. A lot of, you know, grassroots activism happens on Instagram. It's actually become, you know, a platform that really helps movements start up and share information and whatnot. So I would recommend people do take a look at Instagram seriously if they don't already. And then, of course, I actually think that TikTok is quite an important platform for us to also engage with. And Dante can probably talk way more about this, but I do think that we don't want to find ourselves in a situation, and I always quote this podcast Rabbit Hole by the New York Times. We don't want to find ourselves in a situation like, you know, the world did during COVID-19 when we realized that YouTube didn't have any credible sources of information on anything to do with health, that we're investing time and effort into fighting misinformation on those channels. So it's really about understanding, you know, what is that channel that is important. So if you're probably a health NGO, health-related NGO, YouTube might be a good place to start because that's where a lot of those conspiracy theories and misinformation take place. Whereas if you're into social activism and mobilizing people, it might be Instagram. So it's really about thinking about that and then totally okay with focusing on one platform for a little bit.
That's really reassuring. Thank you. I mean, I know a lot of people are terrified they need to be all places all the time, and it sort of causes this massive anxiety. So just to hear you say it's totally fine to do one is brilliant. I can see we've still got questions coming in, but unfortunately we are going to have to wrap up. So one last question for all of you, and you've all mentioned Twitter at least once so far in the conversation today, so I'm going to make it nice and easy. One tweet, super succinct piece of advice. What's your top tip for digital success next year for folks working in the NGO sector? Dante, starting with your tweet for success.
That's a good one. Huh? My one-liner would be focus on what matters to you And once you really have that clarified, once you have identified that real priority that you have for this year, once you have identified all the different audiences and things that you will not be able to accomplish with your limited resources, focus there, and fantastic. I mean, that's basically, it will put you one step closer to that specific goal. I think that's something like that. And the other thing that I just saw in one of the questions we did not address, it's a question from Shiromi about links on social. I will tell you, Shiromi, what I tell all my colleagues when they ask. At least in my view, social media is not the place for you to share links. Basically, links, all algorithms are designed for explicitly not being friendly to links. They delay the experience. They don't want you to share it. So it's great what you mentioned already in terms of investing in SEO, but also other distribution channels like messaging applications, WhatsApp, Viber, Telegram, whatever works for you. Those are places for driving traffic. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn are not for that. If you want to use those channels, focus on the message.
Yeah, brilliant advice. I think I would echo that as well. As much of the value as you can give without needing to direct somebody else where, that's the secret to getting more engagement out of it. Maria, you're after Dante's thread there. You keep it succinct to one tweet. Maria, what's your top tweet?
I will try to not do a thread. My tweet is nurture your community. So
that's super succinct. I love it.
So I can explain a little bit. So by doing the research of what they're interested in seeing from you, and by doing the community engagement work, just nurture your community. Be there. It's a social media platform, so let's be social.
Clues in the name. I think that's really, really valuable advice, especially given what the question from Shiromi was just there. I think there is this idea that we want to use social media a lot of the time as a platform to shout our message, but exactly what you've just said there, the conversation, the connections with people, and the two-way dialogue is the unique thing about social that we can't get anywhere else. So maximizing the potential of that is definitely one of my top tips as well. So thank you for giving that out. And Val, lastly, you.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, so I'll shift gears. I'll retweet Maria and
love it.
Tweet. But I would say one thing to always keep in mind is not just what do we want from our audiences, what do we want our audiences to do, but what does our audience want from us? What do they want us to offer them? What can we offer them? And what value do we add in their lives? So again, going back to the thing we always say, not a one-way conversation, not a broadcasting tool, but a two-way conversation and a way to create connection and community.
Lovely, guys. I found that really, really valuable and interesting at the same time, which I have to say is a rare thing, given some of the stuff that I've been experiencing over the last few months. So thank you so much for giving us both your time and your experience and wisdom. For everybody that tuned in today, thank you also for joining us. I see you've posted loads and loads of questions and comments, so thank you for all of your attention and for your enthusiasm as well. I will do my best to come in and answer some of those after the session. I know that some of the guys, if they manage to get some time later, will also do their best to do that. Please also feel free to share your tips. So I know a lot of you are working in the NGO sector as well. If you want to share your tips in the comments as well, these will stay live for forever, as far as I'm aware. So even though the session is wrapping up now, you'll be able to rewatch it, and also the comments will be there for anybody that comes to see it later. So please do add your voice to the comments as well. But with that, that concludes the first of these episodes of our Ask Us Anything for NGOs. And despite the slight technical hiccup, which was me forgetting to press go at the start, this has been wonderful. Guys, thank you again so much for your time. Thank you to everybody for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one of these Ask Us Anything sessions.
Sounds good. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Cool. Have a good day. Thanks again for your time. See you all.